June 6, 1944. The world stood still. As dawn broke over the English Channel, thousands of ships over 5,000 moved silently through the gray morning fog. Inside them, more than 156,000 Allied soldiers waited, tense and silent eyes fixed ahead toward the shores of Nazi-occupied France. This was not just a battle. This was D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. Its code name, Operation Overlord. Hitler had promised his people that no force on earth could breach it. For years, Hitler's Atlantic Wall had loomed like an impenetrable fortress along the French coast, stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Concrete bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, and heavy artillery. But now, the Allied forces, British, American, Canadian, Free French, and more, were coming to prove him wrong. Antony Beevor writes, never before had the fate of so many rested on the shoulders of so few. Storming ashore into the mouth of enemy fire. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft dropped their ramps onto the sands of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Men collapsed in the surf before they could even raise their rifles. The water turned red with blood, and all hell broke loose. German MG-42 machine guns poured fire into the waves. Mortar shells rained down from hidden positions. The cliffs above were lined with German bunkers. The terrain gave the defenders every advantage. Entire landing waves were wiped out. Radios failed. Units scattered. Chaos ruled. Engineers blew gaps in the barbed wire. Flamethrower. Teams cleared bunkers. Snipers picked off German gunners. By midday, the beachhead was secure. They landed within meters of the target, stormed a position, and held it until relieved. Their success was vital to the entire eastern flank of the invasion. At Omaha Beach, American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced the worst. Ships sunk, paratroopers scattered, beachheads soaked in blood and sweat. But it was a beginning. The wall had cracked. Fortress Europe had been breached. But they did not turn back. One by one, soldiers crawled, sprinted, and clawed their way forward. His response was delayed. Key panzer divisions were held back. Commanders waited for orders that never came. Across the front, similar scenes of horror and heroism unfolded. On Juno Beach, Canadian troops broke through German lines with fierce determination. Despite being delayed by high tide, machine gun nests fired from hidden corners. It was trench warfare all over again, only now in farmlands and forests. At Sword Beach, British commandos raced inland to connect with airborne units who had landed hours earlier to seize bridges and cut German reinforcements. One of those bridges, Pegasus Bridge, was captured in a daring glider assault by the British 6th Airborne Division just after midnight. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured a fragile but undeniable foothold in Normandy. The Germans, particularly elite Waffen-SS units, fought with fanatical resolve. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their homes turned into rubble, their lives shattered by shell fire and fear. These acts of defiance slowed the Nazi response and gave the Allies breathing room to consolidate their position. It had not been easy. German reinforcements traveling by rail or road were bombed to oblivion. Air superiority became one of the most decisive factors of the Normandy campaign. Every field was a trap. Every road was mined. The fighting became slow, brutal, and personal. Over 10,000 Allied casualties. More than 4,000 dead. His dream of empire was burning, and D-Day had struck the match. Hitler had been caught off guard. He knew success on D-Day didn't guarantee victory, but it was the first step that now could not be undone. Despite months of Allied deception, fake armies in Kent, dummy tanks, false radio traffic, he had still expected the main invasion to come at Pas-de-Calais. By the time the German High Command realized the true invasion was underway, it was too late. Antony Beevor noted, the success of D-Day was not just a triumph of arms, but of strategy, deception, and courage. But Normandy was not conquered in a day. The countryside inland was a nightmare of hedge resents. walled thickets that created natural fortresses for German defenders. Tanks couldn't move freely. Visibility was low. Snipers lurked behind every bush. American and British forces called it asterisk, bocage country, asterisk, and they bled for every inch. In the town of Carrington, Saint-Em-Eglis, and battles raged for days. Meanwhile, General Dwight D. watched the chaos unfold from headquarters in Portsmouth. His face was grim behind enemy lines. The French resistance rose up. Sabotage teams blew up train tracks. Bridges were destroyed. German communications were cut. And far above, the skies belonged to the Allies. Thousands of aircraft fighters, bombers, transport, planes flew. By mid-June, over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore. A second front in Western Europe had officially opened. For Hitler, this was a nightmare. He now faced war on all sides. The Soviets crushing him from the east, the Western Allies invading from the west, and partisans rising from within. The liberation of Europe had begun, but the road ahead would still be long, and the blood had only just begun to flow. The beaches were just the beginning. After the sand came the swamps. After the swamps, what lay beyond the D-Day landings was a far more treacherous battlefield, Normandy, bocage country. To the Allied commanders, it was a nightmare. To the German defenders, it was the perfect terrain to bleed their enemy dry. You couldn't see the enemy until you were almost on top of them. A perfect ambush zone. Imagine narrow country roads enclosed by thick, tangled hedgerows, earthen walls, up to 10 feet high, overgrown with thorny shrubs, trees, and underbrush. And that's exactly how the Germans used it. Units like the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fanatical Nazi youth, turned the hedgerows into fortresses. Machine gun nests hidden behind tall grass, anti-tank weapons buried in ditches, mortars zeroed in on every likely path. They began using tanks outfitted with hedgerow cutters, improvised steel prongs, welded to the front to plow through the earthen walls. Infantry squads crawled behind them, throwing grenades and smoke, clearing trenches one at a time. It was a slow, grinding war. A war of feet, not miles. Every street a gauntlet, every house a potential death trap. Ammunition and fuel became precious commodities. American troops learned quickly. He poured reinforcements into the region, many of them from his elite panzer divisions. But each decision was marked by paranoia and delay. He refused to allow flexible responses. Every order had to come from the Führer himself. In battles like Boron and Ridge, they faced waves of counterattacks, brutal artillery and close-quarter fighting that bordered on the medieval. But the German resistance was fierce. The city would not fall until 6 weeks later. After intense bombardments and street-to-street combat, every village, Saint-Lay, Carentan, Tilly-sur-Seulles, became a battlefield of its own. Bombers struck fuel depots, rail yards, and convoys. It began on July 25, 1944, with an aerial bombardment so intense that the ground itself seemed to quake. Resistance fighters relayed enemy positions back to Allied HQ in real time. The front became a chessboard, and the Allies were slowly outmaneuvering their enemy. The German line collapsed. Survivors fled. Others were captured. And for the first time since D-Day, the Allies broke free from the Normandy trap. The British, fighting on the eastern flank, pushed toward Caen, a strategic city that Montgomery had hoped to capture on D-Day itself. Meanwhile, the Canadians, fighting under British command, pushed through some of the hardest terrain and met some of the most determined SS resistance. The goal: trap the bulk of Hitler's army in the west before they could escape toward the Seine. By late June, the weather turned against the Allies. The once proud Wehrmacht was now stretched, starving, and losing ground daily. 4 days, the Falaise pocket became a killing zone. The air reeked of diesel, blood, and burning metal. Tens of tanks and vehicles were left smoldering. It was one of the most devastating defeats the Germans had suffered in the West. Beevor described it as asterisk, a slaughterhouse under open sky. Storms in the channel battered supply lines. Mulberry Harbor's floating docks, created to offload cargo, were damaged. Supplies backed up on the beaches, and still, the Germans held. Crowds filled the streets. Women wept. Flags waved from balconies. Bells rang from churches. France had reclaimed its heart. Hitler believed Normandy was the key to his survival. His refusal to withdraw or regroup cost him dearly. Though casualties were high and progress slow, it pinned down German forces and prevented them from reinforcing the crumbling Western Front. The Allies adapted. Their tactics evolved. Air superiority allowed them to destroy German supply lines. And then came Operation Cobra, the land by the American First Army under General Omar Bradley. Cobra was designed to break out of the Bocage country and unleash the full might of Allied mechanized forces. Over 3,000 aircraft dropped bombs on German positions west of St. Lay. Then came the tanks. American Shermans surged through the wreckage, supported by infantry and engineers. The road to Paris was opening. On the eastern flank, the British launched Operation Goodwood, a massive armored assault near Canada. By early August, German commanders were in disarray. Morale was falling. Supplies were vanishing. Then came the trap. In mid-August, the Allies launched Operation Totalize and Operation Tractable, a pair of assaults designed to encircle German forces retreating through the Falaise Gap. And they nearly succeeded. Thousands of German soldiers were caught in the bottleneck and open plain, surrounded by artillery, aircraft, and advancing tanks. Though some escaped, much of the German 7th Army was destroyed. By late August, the Allies were surging forward. American and Free French troops moved swiftly. Towns liberated, roads cleared, German defenses shattered, and then came the prize. Paris, a city held in chains since 1940. A city that had waited, wept, and resisted. On August 25, 1944, French forces under General Leclerc, with American support, entered the capital to a hero's welcome. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, marched through the Champs. Stayed in Paris. Paris outraged. Paris broken. Paris martyred. But Paris liberated. The moment was electric. It symbolized more than victory. It symbolized hope, the turning of the tide, the collapse of tyranny one city at a time. But the war was far from over. Beyond the Seine, Germany still fought. The Rhine still stood. Hitler still ruled from his bunker in Berlin. Yet the momentum had shifted. From the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy to the cobblestone streets of Paris, the liberation of Western Europe had begun in full force, and the Allies were not going to stop now. With Paris liberated and German forces reeling from the crushing defeat in Normandy, the Allies surged forward. Roads once lined with the thunder of Nazi boots were now echoing with Allied tank treads. Could they strike while the iron was hot and push all the way to Germany's heart before winter? Germany was not yet beaten, and Hitler was not ready to surrender. Fuel shortages plagued the rapidly advancing forces. Supply lines were over. Ammunition, food, and reinforcements lagged behind. The success of Operation Cobra and the breakout from Normandy had been faster than expected. But now the war machine was gasping for breath. As August turned to September 1944, the Allies faced a crucial question. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower saw an opportunity but also a dilemma. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Red Army was steamrolling through Eastern Europe. Stalin's forces had taken vast territories and were pressing toward Poland. The race to Berlin had unofficially begun. Eisenhower knew that time was running out if the West hoped to shape post-war Europe. Field Marshal Montgomery proposed a bold plan, Operation Market Garden. With it, victory could be accelerated. It was a gamble, possibly the riskiest move of the war. The idea: use airborne forces to seize key bridges across the Netherlands, deep behind enemy lines. Then rapidly advance a ground force through the corridor, crossing the Rhine, bypassing the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, and plunging directly into Germany's industrial Ruhr region. German forces entrenched in the estuary still controlled access. As a result, the port remained unusable for weeks, a delay that would cost the Allies dearly in the months to come. The liberation of Brussels on September 3rd was met with celebrations. Crowds lined the streets. Resistance fighters emerged from the shadows. Belgian patriots waved flags, tears streaming down their faces. Cities like Amiens, Arras, and Lille fell swiftly. But when the Allies reached Brussels and Antwerp, the stakes changed dramatically. Justice, vengeance, and catharsis exploded all at once. It was liberation, but also reckoning. It was daring, it was bold, and it would be remembered for both its ambition and its tragedy. But before Market Garden could be launched, the Allies had to continue their momentum through Belgium and Luxembourg. Supplies had to catch up. Reinforcements were needed, and that pause gave Hitler the one thing he desperately needed. In just a few weeks, they had liberated Nancy, Metz, and were pushing toward the German border. But his tanks were nearly out of fuel. Without a working port like Antwerp, supply trucks nicknamed the Red Ball Express struggled to keep up. The Western Front was collapsing. His generals warned him of disaster, but Hitler, detached from reality, issued impossible orders and replaced seasoned commanders with loyal fanatics. The push toward Belgium saw renewed fury in the German defenses. Antwerp was the key. The swastika was torn down and replaced by national flags. School children smiled again. Food was shared with liberated. Families came out of hiding. As they retreated, they laid mines, destroyed bridges, and regrouped behind natural barriers like the Siegfried Line, known in German as the West Wall. A daunting chain of bunkers, trenches, and defenses along the western border of the Reich. Luxembourg had been liberated. The Nazi Empire in the West was disintegrating. It was one of the few deep-water ports in Northern Europe capable of supplying the massive Allied army. Without it, the Allied advance would choke. On September 4, 1944, British forces under Montgomery captured Antwerp largely intact, a stunning success. But they had made a critical error. They had taken the city, but not cleared the Skelter story. A series of channels, rivers, and canals leading to the port. Beevor writes, it was a strategic oversight that prolonged the war by months. In the meantime, Allied soldiers were welcomed as heroes across Belgium, but joy was tempered by the reality of war. In villages and cities, collaborators were hunted. Women who had associated with German officers had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets. As September rolled on, the focus turned to the south. Patton's Third Army advanced across France at lightning speed. Yet Patton, ever defiant, pushed forward. The German army, though bruised, was not broken. The Allies stood at its gates. But instead of pushing headlong, they paused. Logistics demanded it. Time in Berlin, the Führer was furious. Yet in this chaos, he conceived one last great offensive. One final chance to turn the tide. But that storm would come later in the snowy forests of the Ardennes. For now, as September 1944 ended, the Allies controlled most of France and Belgium. Civilians celebrated in the streets. Bells rang. Churches reopened. But behind the smiles were stories of horror, of deportations, of concentration camps, of hunger, of fear, and always the fear it could come back. In the distance, the guns still roared. The Rhine still flowed between freedom and tyranny. And Hitler, though cornered, was far from finished. The road to liberation had begun, but the road to victory would be darker still. Autumn 1944 brought Europe to a strange pause. The Allied armies stood on the borders of Germany, from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Paris and the ports of Antwerp. They had liberated millions, but the war was far from over, and the enemy was still dangerous. As the first frost settled across the Western Front, Allied commanders faced grim realities. The success of the summer had come at a cost. Supply lines were stretched. Men were exhausted. The euphoria of liberation was giving way to the cold grind of sustained warfare. The Germans, using the terrain to their advantage, set ambushes and snipers among the trees. Mud swallowed vehicles. Mines littered the paths. Fog limited visibility. Artillery shells burst in the canopy, raining steel fragments like hail. It stretched across the western German border. Hundreds of bunkers, thousands of minefields, and miles of concrete dragon's teeth designed to halt any tank advance. Now, the final push toward Germany would begin, but it would not be easy. German reinforcements arrived quicker than expected. The paratroopers, lightly armed and outnumbered, were surrounded and eventually overrun. The Siegfried Line, a vast defensive network built by Hitler before the war, stood in their way. In the Hirschgan Forest, just beyond the Belgian-German border, American troops entered one of the darkest chapters of the campaign. He crossed the Moselle River, pushed through the Vosges Mountains, and entered Alsace-Lorraine, a region soaked in the blood of two previous wars, a thick, foreboding woodland. The forest became a trap. Towns like Metz and Nancy were taken after intense fighting. Each village, each crossroads, was contested. But American morale surged when, after months of combat, they began to see German civilians for the first time. Morale dipped. Units were decimated. Some divisions lost over half their men without gaining more than a few kilometers of ground. In his mind, he saw an opportunity not for victory, but for chaos. If he could launch one massive counterattack, perhaps he could split the Allied lines, capture a key port, and force a negotiated peace. The Battle of Hirschgan Forest dragged on for weeks, and countless artillery pieces in the dense forests of the Ardennes. Beevor described it as a useless bloodbath, a grinding, pointless meat grinder that cost over 33,000 American casualties. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden had failed to achieve its ultimate goal. Though British and American airborne troops fought with valor capturing several bridges, the final objective at Arnhem could not be held. Field Marshal Montgomery had promised a bridge too far, and tragically, that's exactly what Arnhem proved to be. Still, the Allies held their ground. The front had not collapsed, and they were learning from every battle. In the south, Patton's Third Army continued its relentless drive toward the German heartland. In the face of resistance, Patton's tanks pushed forward. The war was no longer just a campaign of liberating it. Was now a march into the enemy's home. Survivors spoke in broken voices of trains that never returned, families that vanished, and horrors no one could yet comprehend. But Hitler had one last move left. Civilians, though free, faced famine, displacement, and trauma. Antony Beevor emphasizes this in his writing, not just the military achievements, but the moral dimension of what the Allies were fighting for. Cities like Caen, Saint-Lay, and Le Havre had been leveled in the fighting. Infrastructure was destroyed, winter was approaching, and coal was scarce. He had watched the Allies spread out across the front, fatigued, low on fuel, and believing that the worst was behind them. The Rhine River, the last major geographic barrier before the heart of Germany, lay just ahead. And so, in secret, he assembled over 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge. But that story of frozen foxholes, desperate defenses, and surprise assaults belonged to the bitter winter yet to come. Back in the present, as October 1944 came to a close, the Allies had made extraordinary gains. It had cost tens of thousands of lives, but it had delivered hope, freedom, and fire into lands that had once known only darkness. France had been liberated. Belgium and Luxembourg were free. The Netherlands was half liberated and still fighting. The German border had been reached in multiple sectors, but liberation came at a price. Over 200,000 Allied casualties. Since the entire villages had been reduced to rubble, and the Holocaust, though still largely hidden, was beginning to be exposed. In Belgium and France, the Allies began to uncover Nazi transit camps, abandoned prisons, and the early signs of mass deportation. The fight for liberation was never just about territory. It was about humanity. It was about stopping something evil before it consumed the entire world. In every liberated village, the smiles of the children, the tears of old men, the kisses thrown to soldiers and tanks, all of it was proof. This war mattered, and it had to be won, not just quickly, but completely. By November 1944, Eisenhower's armies were poised for the final push, but it would not be crossed without blood. The Nazis were wounded, cornered, and desperate but not yet defeated. And so, the world held its breath again. The road to liberation had passed through beaches, bocas, cities, and forests. Now, the battle for Germany would begin, and Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was running out of time.